Today we're going to do sort of a short intro to people who are not necessarily data jockeys, data gurus like my friend Kai is. One of the things that I go around trying to do as often as I can is I realize that most of us got into HR at a time when all of this analytics stuff was what? I mean, we got into it because we were people. We got into it because we could relate. And all of these numbers is something that has come up pretty much since a lot of us have started, and it's something that we have to learn along the way. And often I see conferences like this when you get 1,000 people out there, many of whom already know what they're doing, but some of whom are still trying to figure out, well, how does one do this? The second part that I've sort of seen as I've gone around trying to help other people get into analytics is the fact that there is a big tendency to say, well, analytics should be done by analytics people. And we should have a room full of priests in black robes with crystal balls all trying to figure out how to do this, and that they all work with really sophisticated, incomprehensible tools, and then I can go on being a people person. I also don't think it works quite like that. I think the idea is that we all need to become analytically savvy, that we all need to become able to have analytical thinking, and that every person in the HR department needs to be able to model, and needs to be able to understand how things flow from A to B, and how do you phrase things properly. So that's what we're going to try to do today. What we're going to try to do today is a short session on what does it take to become analytically savvy? What kind of framework do you have to do? And then what we're going to do is then show it to you. Show it to you not with the big, powerful, statistical, super-duper tools that some of these priests in black robes want to sell you, but with very straightforward, simple stuff. And what we have is an Excel sort of worksheet with data on it, and we're going to use Tableau, which, of course, the Tableau people will tell you it is a big, sophisticated, nasty tool. But in reality, it is what Excel will become. It will be, in 5 years' time at most, what Excel is today. Everybody will be using Tableau in 5 years' time because it is the most powerful way that we have, and the most standardized way that we have to make data visualization and analytics come to life. So that's really what our intent is today. That's why we're calling it a little bit of the fundamentals of HR analytics. What does it take for every person in the HR function to become analytically savvy? Okay, so she's already introduced us. I just want to make 2 quick points. One is that I have been doing HR in all kinds of fashions for a long time. Basically, it was sometime in the late 90s that I first understood the power of analytics. And it was the first day that I was working at Pepsi at the time, and it was the first day that I had a meeting at Pepsi where when I presented, no one spoke. And that was my greatest day of glory. Because every time, and we all know this because we are all doing HR, you go up there and you have an opinion about how we should do this and how we should. In this particular case, what we're talking about is recruiting profiles for the sales force in Mexico, okay? So what kind of recruiting profile we should have? And of course, we had a whole bunch of distribution centers with all distribution center managers, all of whom had their own idea of what a distribution center salesperson should look like. Sound familiar? Yeah. So what we wanted to find out is, for our recruiters, it was madness because they were trying to recruit all kinds. Guys, come to the front as much as you can. We still have room up here, only because the numbers will look very small in the back. For our recruiters, it was madness because we were trying to recruit, for this distribution center in the west of the country, they wanted people with high school education only. And on the east side of the country, they wanted people that had college education. And on the south, they wanted people who were inexperienced. And the north, they wanted people that already had experience working in the sector. And there were some other people that thought you never rehire the people that left. Everybody had their own book on what it took to be the right salesperson. So every time we wanted to have this debate, we, the HR people, would then come in and say, well, this is madness. We can't really do this. There's got to be one single approach. The invariable answer would be, what do you know? You've never managed a sales team. So do what I want. And so it was hard. I'll make the story short. What I managed to do was make a model with all of the recruiting variables, education, experience, age, and whatnot. And from that model, calculated that if all of the sales force had a specific profile, sales would go up by 3.4%. Now at Pepsi, you know, we fight that other people that sell stuff in red cans. When we try to get increases in market share, we measure our increases of market share in 0.1% at a time. For the HR guy to come in and say, I can increase sales by 3.4%, you know, the marketing people don't make those claims. The salespeople don't make those claims. And here's HR saying I can. 3.6% of increase after we implemented our plan. That's when I learned about analytics. That's the day I showed up and said, this is the right profile of the sales force. This is the model that says this is what we're going to do. Any questions? And that silence was beautiful. That's what I want you to learn. I did all of that in just Excel. I didn't know anything else. So, Kai, on the other hand, actually knows how to do his stuff. He's been working with Tableau 4 years, I think. He is a data guru, and he calls himself a data guru because he actually is. And he is going to then show you how all of this comes to life. But what I want to be sure that you also understand is that you don't need to be a data guru to do this. What you need to do is learn how to use simple analytical thinking and simple tools. Okay. Right. So you probably have heard stuff like this, and you'll hear it all day today or tomorrow. Why do we need to be more analytical? You get it, right? Okay. I'll tell you one point that's really important. The point about better insights. The difference in that story with Pepsi is that I was always going with my gut against the gut of every other leader in that room. Gut to gut, I lost almost every time. Data to gut, I won every one. So the point I make is that if you really want to have a seat at the table, if you really want to have that title of being strategic business partner, they all talk to each other with data. We need to talk to them with data. So change gut to gut to data to gut, or at least data to data. And success then becomes better. More or less like this. Traditionally, we do things like, you know, Alex resigned. Let's make a counteroffer. We react. Okay? If you get a little bit better at it, you will say something like, our exit interviews are giving us some data that say maybe salary is partially responsible for turnover. Therefore, I should give Alex a salary increase, still as a counteroffer. What we really want to get is into the kind of thinking that says, we already know that people that have this kind of comp ratio and these other characteristics tend to resign with a high degree of probability. And we also know that if we can impact some of the other things without necessarily moving the pay, that will increase their chances of staying. That's really what we're trying to move to. What we're trying to move to is a way that we can be a lot more predictive about what we do. But in HR, we tend to stay still at this level here. For those of you that are all the way in the back, I am sure you can't read. I'm going to tell you what it says. It says anecdote, reactive, ongoing reporting, segment and comparison, then correlation, causation, and simulation. And what we're trying to do is move from descriptive analytics to diagnostic analytics and eventually to predictive analytics. And that all can be done with simple tools. Okay? So, if we stay in the story that my heads of sales were all into, I know that if I hire people with no experience, they don't have any bad habits. If I hire people with experience, they have bad habits. I have to unlearn it. So I want to hire people with no experience so they have no bad habits so I can tell them which bad habits they should have. Okay? That is all anecdotal. What we want to move them is way up here, or at least, way up here or at least way over here in a way that says that you shouldn't be doing that. What you really ought to be doing is figuring out what actually drives sales from an HR point of view. So move from the what happened type of descriptive question to the why did it happen type of diagnostic question, and eventually to the what's likely to happen, which is more the predictive type of question. So how do one do that? One does this following this model, and that's truly my last slide. This is the key, the core of analytical thinking. The core of analytical thinking is to follow this 8-step process. For those of you that will get the slides at some point later, the rest of the slides just go into detail into each one of these. Parenthesis here to make a quick advertising. If you show up tomorrow we will do this with more time and therefore with more detail. And tomorrow, which will be at SMU, we will actually have you all get onto Tableau so that you can do it yourself. Okay? So if you haven't decided which breakout you're going to go to tomorrow or which walkabout you're going to go to tomorrow, we are happy to welcome you again and cover this in more detail. So what's the first problem? The first issue is defining the business problem in a business sense. And defining the business problem in a business sense means that you're trying to answer a business question, not an HR question. Let me make this clear. In very simple terms, when we are trying to solve a problem using statistics, we're going to come up with an equation. Okay? I promise you it's not deep mathematics. An equation looks like this. Y equals A plus BX, where X is the variable that you think you can control, and Y is the variable you're trying to predict. If you make Y be turnover and X be salary, that's an HR problem. You're trying to answer an HR question with an HR data. What you really ought to do is you make Y a business variable. What that means is that Y should be profits. That Y should be revenue growth. That Y should be something the business actually cares about. We make the business care about turnover, not because turnover is good or bad, but because that turnover has implications in terms of sales, revenue growth, profitability, time to respond to clients, customer satisfaction scores. Those are the things that the business has on their KPIs. So if you can make that Y variable a business KPI variable, then they're so willing to listen. So the first point I really try to make is it should be a business problem, not an HR problem. Turnover is a means to an end. Engagement scores, means to an end. Second, before you even look at data, and this is where I see most people fail. Most people will go into, let's look at the data and see what it tells me. If you can learn one thing about sitting with us for 45 minutes today, one thing is avoid looking at the data until you know what you're looking for. Truly, if you start looking at data, it's needle in the haystack type of problem. Every single time. And I have seen people fail tremendously. Because you can go in so many ways, in so many paths, and you can get wronged so many times, dead ends, wrong turns, or worse, you truly miss the forest for the trees. So second point, formulate your hypothesis. And your hypothesis ought to be simple and straightforward. It's a question. You don't really want to get into the scientific approach of the not hypothesis and all of that. That's great for us PhDs, but for the rest of humankind, that's not what you need. What you really need is a question. And the question is, what is the impact of turnover on sales revenue? What is the impact of recruiting profiles on sales growth? Very simple, straightforward questions. That's your hypothesis. And your hypothesis could be, I believe that a simple remedy like increased training for people at risk will reduce my manpower turnover by this much. That's a reasonable that's a reasonable hypothesis to make. But the point I make here is not so much can you make a question. That's the easy part. The point I really make here is make the question before you start looking at data. Then you start collecting your data. Then you go figure out, okay, what data do we have and what data do we need? You may find that you have pretty much everything you need, and whatever you don't need, then go collect that. As opposed to trying to figure out what data do I have, what questions can I answer, first try to figure out what's the question, then what's the data you're going to need after that. Then you go into, there's a lot more into that. There's a whole data cleaning and data processing and data warehousing, and okay, yes, that's all important. It needs to happen. It absolutely needs to happen. But once you have that all set up as part of your data gathering, then you analyze that data. This is when you actually use some degree of statistics, some degree of finance. So it is important to understand some degree of statistics. But pretty much 80 to 90% of what you're going to answer, you're probably going to do no statistics at all. You're just going to make a chart, and it's going to look like this. Some of it will require some degree of regression. If you're sophisticated, you can do a multiple regression. If you're really sophisticated, you can go into even more sophisticated stuff. But the truth of what I'm trying to tell you is you don't need all of that for 80 to 90% of the stuff that you will do on a daily basis. And that gets you a long way there. What else do you need to know about data analytics? Two other points. One is you do need to understand a little bit of stats, probably to the extent of what's R squared. And if I ask most of you, I won't embarrass you, but if I ask most of you all know what R squared means, you probably have some vague recollection from some day that you took this at some point in your life that the higher the R squared, the better. That's about all you need to know. Okay? The second point that you need to know is finance. And you probably need to understand finance to, again, not a very sophisticated degree, but to some degree. For instance, what is the difference between EBIT and EBITDA? If I ask most of you people, you will probably be able to rattle it off. Oh, EBIT means earnings before interest and taxes, and EBITDA as depreciation and amortization. That's great. You're about 60% of the way there. The remaining 40% is, when is it right to use which? Now, why is this important? Because everybody else around that table knows the answer to that question. And if you want to be a strategic business partner, you need to know the answer to that question too. So that's about as much as finances you need to understand, which you probably get in about day 4 or 5 of your finance course. The only other trick that the finance people know that we HR people need to know, and the day we learn this trick, we also get really good at it, is NPV. NPV, again, if I ask most of you what's NPV, again, some dusty part of your brain says net present value. And you go, net present value, what is that for? And you will remember it's something to do with discounting future cash flows. Okay, so this is how finance figures out whether something is worth doing or not. What they're trying to figure out is, if I put some money today that is supposed to generate some savings in the future, okay, typical stuff that we say, if you put in a training program today, it's got some benefits in the future, right? That benefit in the future, money tomorrow is worth less than money today, right? Okay, so you have to discount the cash flow to figure out if the effect of that is higher or lower than the money that you're investing today. So if you're investing in a training program today, whatever you think is going to happen, let's say you're going to save money because you're going to improve your quality yield in your manufacturing site, you just need to figure out if that saving is enough to cover the investment that you made in training in the beginning. That is all the finance you need to know. Pretty much after that is nice to have, but for analytics, that gets you, again, about 80% of where you need to be. So that data analysis should give you one thing only, an insight. And an insight means an aha moment. An insight means, oh, I hadn't thought of that. An insight means that when I'm measuring my sales force, and I can tell them, you know, if you have all salespeople like this, sales goes up by 3.4%, the insight was, it is not true that each one of you has a different model and that every model works. There is actually a good model. That is what gets you to then make recommendations. And those recommendations should be, again, an HR recommendation to improve a business situation, which, if you set it up right in the beginning by trying to answer a business question, your story then becomes a business answer. Then tell your story. And here what I normally recommend is ditch all of the analysis that you did. Show just the one thing that they want to know. The most impactful presentations I find that I do with business leaders take about 3 slides. I don't start with 7 years ago our forefathers. I don't start with when Sir Stanford Raffles first showed up in Singapore. I don't do that. I basically say, the answer to your question is, there is a single source of talent that will help drive our sales up. And then I say, and the reason I know this is because I did this, and that's the answer. If there are any questions, good, I'm prepared. I do have my 20 other slides in the back, but I don't present them all. So that you can do with insights. You tell a story, and this is where visualization also comes in, and hopefully you can then implement and evaluate. And the idea is that things are dynamic. Once you change, say, the sales force in this case, you see your sales going up, then you try to see, okay, now that I got the profile right, what else needs to happen? Now do I need to answer training questions, or do I need to improve my pay system? So you're never done. You're only done with answering that question, but always new questions come up. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to let Kai drive you through the rest.
Sure. All right. See if this works. Thank you. Yep, can we change it? All right, can you hear me at the back? Cool. All right, thanks, Fermin. So I've been left with 10 minutes. That's all good. I reckon I can do the shorthand version, but I may go a little bit over, so apologies if that happens. To the first point, I actually met Fermin about 2 years ago now, I think last year, 3 years ago, helping him with his students. So a lot of the HR students that are coming through are actually starting to use Tableau and use this like analytics as part of what the skills they have going into the future. So just realize that the future is already happening in the universities. Hands up if you've heard of Tableau. Ooh, okay. Keep your hand up if you've used Tableau. Okay, there's a few of you. Good. So you kind of know what's coming. That's great. And so to talk to Fermin's point, I want to demonstrate what typically happens. And there's one point I will point out here that Fermin said. Something about not seeing the data beforehand. Hands up if you had a dashboard like this in your company that you've seen. It doesn't have to be Tableau, but something like this that you've seen, and you always see it every day, or someone brings it up every blue moon, and you take a look at it, and it doesn't do anything, right? So this comes to Fermin's point. I'm not in HR, but the whole point of Tableau is to help people see and understand data. It's about the people doing the analysis. A dashboard's great, but what's the point of it unless it has a purpose? And so if I'm looking at this and I'm looking at a business problem, let's take a look at this data. And so what we're seeing here is literally just employment data. It is HR data, as Fermin said. But we're going to look for something in here, and we've noticed that maybe not through the data, maybe through this dashboard, we start to see that there's been an issue with drop-offs of individuals in engineering. We've seen a lot of people turn over in engineering recently. So HR problem, but it's a business problem. Obviously, we know that the business problem there is that if we don't know who these individuals are, but if they're tenured people, that's experience that we need to have. That's money that's been lost by the business in having to re-educate. So maybe I come to our typical HR dashboard that we've got, seeing it here. You can see things like where we're located around APAC, what the average salary is for men or women in a particular department. And so to Fermin's point about a little bit of statistical knowledge, hands up if you know what a box and whisker plot is. If you don't, that's okay. Okay, so a box and whisker plot is very important. So it's this one on the right-hand side. What it tells me is generally the spread of what people are earning in this case. It's very important. So usually it shows you the spread of what people are earning, maybe a score in a test, whatever that may be. That's what a box and whisker plot does. But in regards to salary, what it at least tells me is that what's the spread and disparity between two sources? Take, for example, women and men. And so if I'm looking at this one here, I'm going to look at engineering. So engineering is this one. You can see it right here. So let's go in and zoom in a little bit on this engineering box and whisker plot. And let's say I'm looking at my analysis, and I can see that men have a higher propensity to earn more. And so what this means is that these green dots are all the men, and this little line that I've highlighted is basically what's called an interquartile range. It's 1.5 times the maximum of the median spread. So this is like, think of it like the potential that they can earn. And you can see that it's very, very disparate to what females can earn. So I could leave this and that could be my analysis, but really what we want to do, as I said, is not just look at data, but we want to analyze and ask questions. We want to have that scientific theory that Fermin's talking about to have this. So let's go in and analyze this. What would we do from here? Well, in Tableau, I'm just going to open up a new worksheet. And this is what it kind of looks like. I've got that same view that we saw before on the dashboard, but I've just brought it here. Now, I only want to look at engineering. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to press this keep only and keep only engineering. That's all that's of interest to me. My business problem is there's a turnover in engineering, and I need to find out what the problem is because it's costing us money in education and knowledge. So let's keep that only. Okay, so from here, I have my first hypothesis. I'm only looking at salary here, but I notice in my data I have bonus. So people obviously get a bonus as well, and maybe this bonus is being compensated to women for the lower salary. That's one hypothesis right there. So let's go ahead and drag out, let's get rid of the department and gender. So I'm going to go into my analysis, get rid of those guys, maybe my box and whisker for now. And I'm going to drag in bonus and see what the comparison is. So I'll just make that a little bit bigger for you guys. And you'll notice something interesting. So salaries along this axis here, and then there's the bonus at the bottom. And I can't really tell a distinction between men and women. There's not really that big distinction here, right? And so from this analysis, my hypothesis is actually incorrect. I had a hypothesis, and that's okay. You're going to come to dead ends when you have these hypotheses. And so in this case, I wasn't exactly right. The data said something else. Actually, men and women get about the same bonuses, and that's clearly not the situation that's going on here. So I need to go back. I need to have a new hypothesis. I need to think about this. And so if that's not the case and my hypothesis is incorrect, I'll just go back to here. I could look at something like what I was saying with tenure. I noticed there was a lot more older people that were leaving in engineering. So I do have tenure. I can see the tenure group here in my data. So let's just go and drag that one in instead. So I don't need department anymore. I'm just going to get tenure, and I'm going to put that in there. And so what I'm seeing here is something a little bit different. So each one of these is a tenure group. Less than 1 year, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, and so on. Pretty simple stuff, right? But each of these is showing me the male and female cohort for those groups. And I can start to see what that spread is now across different tenures. Okay. So this is getting somewhere, but my new hypothesis, obviously salary isn't an issue. I can see that it's kind of popping up a little bit everywhere, but I noticed that there's a bonus included in there. So I don't know about you, but obviously at Tableau, I have an on-target earnings, which is my bonus and my salary together. So let's go ahead and not look at that. I've actually made a calculation here. Simple stuff, simple mathematics, just to simply say, get my salary, get my bonus, I put them together. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's bring my OTE instead of salary. And now I'm starting to see something a little bit more interesting. So interestingly, 3 to 5 years, there's almost parity between men and women in the spread for their OTE. But as you go along to 5 to 10 years, 10 to 15 years, and 15 years and above, I'm starting to notice that there's a bigger and bigger gap coming up. Okay, so that spread means now that there's a less propensity for a woman to make as much as a man. It doesn't mean that they won't, it just means that the potential that they can reach is lower than what it is for a man. All right, so that's interesting. What else can we look at? Well, I know we have performance grades. Are we paying equally on performance grades? So let's take, for example, performance grades, and let's put that instead on color rather than gender. So these two things, these two bars are still female and male, but the colors now represent the different grades. So A being the highest and E being the lowest. So if I look at this, E is actually doing pretty well, right? There's a bit of consistency there. There's a few outliers as you'd expect, but generally they're about consistent. Let's go take a look at the higher end. So if I look at C, I can start to see a problem popping up. I can see in 15 years and above that there's a lot more men earning at a C grade performance a highest OTE. We can go to B, still seeing the same problem, and A. So what this allows me to realize is that, okay, with a couple of clicks and drags and drops, I can start to have that hypothesis, and I realize that, well, actually, the outcome here of this analysis is that the grades and the tenure are not in alignment. So what's happening is that we're not paying fairly for a woman who's earning at an A grade, particularly, let's say, for example, in this 10 to 15 years. You can see that big disparity right there. There's a lot of outliers earning higher for men in that 10 to 15 year category. So my action, what is my action here? What is the business benefit here? Well, as Fermin said, I can go ahead and bring into a story to kind of tell these exact same things to the individuals. that need to know. And what's most important is the business value. So if we lose these potential individuals that have such an experience and tenure and have a high grade, and they're dropping off after 5 years of work in our company, then we're losing a wealth of knowledge, and that's a lot of income that we're going to have to spend to actually re-educate people and bring them back up to speed. We lose inner knowledge that we may not even know existed. So through that analysis, I have come to an action that I can take and I can present back and that we need to start working on. Maybe it's career development and reaching out to the individuals that, female individuals that have just reached 5 years and saying, hey, how are things going? What's working, what isn't working, and start to work on that. And so the value here is going through that scientific process that Fermin talked about. And I just want to show how you can start looking at it with actual technology, with data, with minimal skills. It's about the people and being able to have that question and understanding. Not about technical experience, simply being able to have the technology there for you to go in and ask those questions. So with that, hopefully that's given you a bit of an idea. Back to you, Fermin.
Well, that's what we wanted to sort of go by today, just to show you quickly how we can become more analytical just by following the right process, which is what the analytical process is about, and by using tools that are readily available to everybody, that don't really require much more than learning how to use the software. And like Kai says, is more drag and drop than pretty much anything else. So it's up to us really to start down this path. And if I can leave one last word with all of you, analytics, or HR analytics, is feasible for everyone in the department. And you should make it a point that everyone should be analytically savvy. I don't know if we have time for anything.
We have time for a couple of questions. Any questions from the audience?
Okay.
Quiet crowd.
I guess we were very clear.
Yeah. Perfect. So, oh,
Oh, please. Actually, my preferred mode is to try to answer business questions, like I said in the beginning. So my preferred mode is taking a business question like sales or profits, and then trying to figure out the HR variables that impact it. And the HR variables may be many. Just to give you quickly another example of something I've done before, we're working with a bank to try to figure out how to improve profitability of the bank branches, the retail branches. From an HR perspective, what were the HR things that we needed to do to improve branch profitability? So that had to do, in the end, after we looked at all kinds of things, we looked at pay, we looked at training, we looked at recruiting profiles, we looked at proportion of full-time to part-time, and we discovered that there were only 3 things that mattered. Thing number 1 that mattered was the amount of training that they received. And the amount of training they received was a U-shaped curve. They needed to receive at least this many hours of training, which ended up being around 80 hours of training per year. But there was a point at which there was no additional benefit, and at an additional point where actually it started being of harm to the business. That was about 200 hours of training. The second one that made a difference had to do with having an incentive system, not how much of the incentive system. And the third one that made a difference had to do with the turnover of the branch. The HR manager, for instance, was really big on some of the things that she wanted to do, which included some team training, and none of that made any difference. So to me, those are the things. This one that we showed just happens to be a data set that we had available that we thought we could use to you. So it's not that comp is more prone or less. In fact, if you ask me, prone is actually one of the least prone ones. I've had more success with recruiting and training than I've had with comp. Sorry. When you don't have the availability, the quality of data, you'll have a problem. Because with no data, not much you can do. But I'll give you 2 points on this. Most of the data that you need actually already exists. In HR, it is not true that we deal with big data. Most of the stuff that we do is actually small data. Most of the stuff we do actually already exists in-house. So it's in your HRIS, it's in your payroll system, it's in the engagement system, it's in the sales forecasting or in the sales commission system. So a lot of what you need already exists. And the data is fairly clean because that's what you're using to pay people with. If it's not clean, yeah, okay. But my second point then applies to that, which is bad data is still better than no data. Okay? Good data is better than bad data, but bad data is better than no data. So even with bad data, if you can make reasonable assumptions about the quality of that data, still go through the analysis and just make sure that you have the caveats when you tell people your outcome, that you have some degree of, but it's still in the ballpark.